as vice presidents. So I'm Mark Gardner, I'm retiring at the AGM today, and Barbara is also a vice president. She is also retiring, but she has one more duty to carry out before she does so. And that is to talk to us about the Staffordshire Hoard. Barbara Yorke is Professor Emeritus at the University of Winchester and an honorary professor at the Institute of Archaeology in London. She's a very well-known scholar of early medieval England, and her works are prodigious. She's written on all sorts of subjects, but particularly I would pick out the conversion to Christianity, on Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and kings, on nunneries, and on King Alfred, and particularly on the Kingdom of Wessex. I think it's notable, though, although she's a historian, she's frequently used archaeological evidence in her work. And tonight she's going to speak on that archaeological subject, but from a historical perspective, the Staffordshire Hoard and the history of 7th century England. Barbara.
Thank you. Right, I'm not sure about doing the.
Can you share your screen, Barbara? It's the.
Yeah, it's I'm not sure where I do that.
It's the, I think, a bar at the bottom, it says share screen.
Ah, yeah, I've got it now. Yes, it didn't come up on one of my other.
Super.
Here it is. Right, has that come up for everyone?
Yeah, that's visible.
Right. Sorry for that short delay, but here I am now. And thank you, Mark, for your kind words of introduction. Mark's just chaired the AGM and he thanked everybody who was leaving, but there wasn't anybody to thank him. So I'd like to just thank him for all the work that he's done, particularly in the lead up to the AGM, where they might be used as contribute to the history of the period in which it's based. And I expect many of you have seen this wonderful publication on the Staffordshire Hoard, an Anglo-Saxon Treasure, edited by Fern and Tania, Dickinson and Leslie Webster. And the good news is that you can download this for free at Archaeology Data Service, or one word there, .ac.uk. So if you want to find out more, please consult that. This is it's a description of all the items that were discovered, and it's a place to go if you want to know any more about them. There are also some general chapters, and indeed I wrote one about the history of the period and providing a background to the hoard. But there wasn't the opportunity in the book, which is already pretty big, as any of you who've had to carry at home will know, to look at some of the wider implications and how it might feed into the history of the 7th century. And so that's what I want to do this evening. So I'm going to begin with a very quick recap about the basic information we have about the hoard, just in case everybody is not up to speed on this. And here we see the metal-detectorist Terry Herbert, who had what must be the find of a lifetime in 2009 at what seems a rather unpromising site near the A5 and the M6 in the Cannock Chase. But you see its location here near to Lichfield, which was the Mercian bishopric, and just off the screen, disappearing off the screen, Tamworth, another important Mercia centre. So this is a find made in Mercia, and it's really taken to the heart of Mercian people, the queue to see the hoard at Birmingham City Museum, and which together with Stoke are now the owners of the hoard. And here are the objects of the hoard laid out at Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery. And you can see there's a lot of them, but they're not very big. And they're all on this table. And they're all very much cut up into parts, apart from the pommels, which on themselves are a whole, but there were about 4,000 objects in all, but they resolved down to more like 600 objects. And the greater part of the objects, about 80%, are parts of the sword hilt. There aren't any blades of the swords, but there are these items from the sword hilt and the various types of metal object, for this is what we have, are shown here. So you can see some of them are very small bits indeed, and quite a lot of them are needed to assemble a whole hilt there. So they form a very large part, and that's very unusual find. Included amongst these fittings are ones of a axe, a long knife, and this is one of the premier objects of the hoard, which you can see made in gold and garnet jewellery. And these are wonderful drawings by Chris Fern, show the animal art which is decorating it. And if you want a smaller guide to the hoard, I can recommend this one by Chris Fern and George Speak on beasts, birds and gods, which is certainly obtainable from Birmingham and Stoke museums and probably elsewhere as well. And the largest numbers of objects when put together made up this wonderful helmet. Not exactly this helmet, because this is a reconstruction, but enough survived to enable this reconstruction to be made. George Speak has been in particular really responsible for putting this together. You can see it's along the ground lines of a Roman parade helmet. None of the wonderful top knot survived, but enough showed that there must have been a crest. This is what the helmet looked like. It had been chopped up into the smallest number of pieces available, and many of them were not found, but as I said, there was enough available for it to be reconstructed. Probably just the one helmet, possibly two, but probably just the one of them. So that's the helmet and the sword fittings. Those are the majority of finds. So there are a few other things which are particularly notable. These possible saddle fittings, again, you see in that same wonderful golden garnet jewellery. Again, perhaps just one remarkably well fitted out horse. And a number of religious objects, which are certainly some of the most interesting objects of the hoard, and are really the earliest such metalwork objects known from Anglo-Saxon England. Here we have a pendant cross that could be worn, and perhaps a processional cross that could be carried into battle. It's actually rather bigger than the pendant cross, not quite as shown here, but you can see the little figure carrying it to show what it would be like. And a very famous item, which is amongst the religious items, perhaps also from a cross, perhaps taken from a reliquary, which actually has this quotation from it, Numbers, "Rise up, O Lord, and may thy enemies be dispersed, and those who hate thee be driven from thy face." This shows how Anglo-Saxons were really very willing to accept Christianity, because it could be fitted to what they felt a religion should do, which is to disperse your enemies. Interesting enough, there's been a slight change in the wording, perhaps deliberate on the sword. So instead of enemies dispersed, what this quotation actually says is torn apart, which sounds rather more violent, but perhaps appropriate when we think what the hoard is like, because that has been torn apart. And this is something that has to be borne in mind whenever one's making any interpretation of the hoard. This is what the hoard is like: broken, folded, ripped, pulled apart by people who knew what they were doing, professional smiths with professional tools. This is not just damage made in battle, it's not just damage by the plough, a deliberate disassembling of items. That and the very selective nature of the material are things through which we have to think how to interpret the whole. Now, it's obvious there are various different stages in assembling the hoard, and this is a breakdown at their most simple. We've also got the original production of the objects. We've got the point at which the objects were acquired from the original owners. We've got a point at which objects were disassembled, the pommels and hilt fittings removed from the swords, the items chopped up, and then we've got the burial of the objects in Staffordshire. So I'm not going to say so much about the original production of the objects. That's what Chris Fern has done in the wonderful book. But I do want to explore these different phases. And this is Chris's plan of the chronological phases of the hoard. And you can see some of the objects were definite, much older heirlooms. And the majority of them date to between the late 6th century and the middle of the 7th century. But there are some items that seem to be, from analogies, in a slightly older, slightly more recent phase. And that, of course, if you're dating a hoard, those are the ones that have got to date it, suggesting that it may have been deposited in the 3rd quarter of the 7th century. I may say there isn't any dating material in the hoard, nothing that can be radiocarbon dated, for instance. And so these dating phases are by analogy with similar objects from other sites that can be dated through association with coins or with radiocarbon dating. And the description of the dates is discussed in detail by Chris Fern in the book. So, as you can imagine, the finds of all this large number of objects in the hoard has really revolutionized study of this material from Anglo-Saxon England. And my map here on the right is showing you fine spots of gold and silver pommels before the Staffordshire Hoard came. I mean, the hoard is there. And these are items here are all individual items that have been discovered. And you can see it greatly increased the numbers. And the pommels that we have, because they were so rare before, it was assumed that only the really, really top level of society might have possessed them. But now we've got so more of them, we seem to see the suggestion that a greater number of the army, still elites, but not necessarily just the leaders of elites, had these wonderful hoards. But what I really want to point out with these maps is that Mercia and the fine spot of the hoard is right on the edge of this material. And this is true of Mercia generally. Its name means the borderers, people on the border, and they are on the border of Anglo-Saxons on this side and Britons on this, the original inhabitants. Of course, there are Britons living in this area as well, but we also have larger numbers of people who have either come in from North Sea areas or who have adopted the way of life of North Sea areas. And you can see in particular East Anglia and Lincolnshire as major find spots. And down here at Kent of gold and silver spines, but not so many, not any of these gold and silver pommels of the type that were found in the Staffordshire Hoard. And so this question, where does the material come from? Well, as you'll have guessed from what I've been saying, it doesn't seem to come from Mercia. There aren't parallels in Mercia. And so the deduction has been made that the objects must have come from outside Mercia and from enemies of Mercia. And this is yet another thing that Chris Fern has had to explore in his book. And the area where there are most obvious parallels, not for everything, but for some items, is with East Anglia and with the Sutton Hoo ship burial. Though, of course, this is due to having the Sutton Hoo ship burial. If we didn't have the Sutton Hoo ship burial, these parallels, of course, would not be so obvious. And it may be that there are other parts of the country where there are magnificent burials yet to be discovered, or where people were wearing material like the Sutton, or owning material like that of the Sutton Hoo ship burial, but we can't see it in such numbers. But as it stands, there are some very striking parallels with the Sutton Hoo ship burial, as Chris Fern has shown. And for instance, this is the Great Gold Cross, and this decoration here, you can see how very strongly this is paralleled by finds from one of the decorated on the Maplewood cups, on the rims of the Maplewood cups from the Sutton Hoo ship burial. And also very striking, as you may have realized, are the parallels with the Sutton Hoo helmet, and certain features of the Staffordshire Hoard helmet are paralleled extremely closely in the Sutton Hoo helmet, and that was obviously an influence upon it. Also, other iconography is very similar. Here you see this sort of wonderful bird of prey, this time showed in gold, but very many similarities to the golden garnet bird of prey, including a very distinctive, I don't know if you can see this, but there's a sort of Y shape that outlines the beak here of the bird. And this Y shape is very unusual and is only found in the Staffordshire Hoard and Sutton Hoo ship burial. So it's another close parallel. And you'll have seen the exquisite golden garnet work on the Staffordshire Hoard, and some of it approaches that on the Sutton Hoo ship burial. But there are other areas which also have produced some striking parallels. I mentioned Lincolnshire as another area of finds, and this particular filigree work on pommels, which there are many examples of on the Staffordshire Hoard. Some of the best finds for that have been from Lincolnshire. And Lincolnshire was a separate kingdom in the 7th century, Kingdom of Lindsay, but one that was disputed between Mercia and Northumbria, both of which wanted to take it over and both of which controlled it at different periods. Oh, right, here we are. Other possible areas, well, possibly Kentish finds here. This is one that Chris Fern has picked out with these wonderful horses fighting. You might have a bit of trouble seeing them, but here they are drawn out by Chris, and parallels with this item. And particularly on the back of this pommel, there is what is thought to be a depiction of a basilica, which again there are some close parallels from some finds from Kent. This is one of the Christian items that's not a liturgical item, but just part of some of the pommels have got crosses on them as well. Some of them have got things which aren't Christian, but this one has, as you can see, some little crosses on these. So both Christian and pre-Christian symbols are represented. So Kent is another possibility, but as you'll see before, there hasn't actually been finds of exactly the same sorts of pommels from Kent, with just one or two exceptions, but not in quite the same form. The real area that's missing, or which one would expect to find represented perhaps, is Northumbria, which was one of the enemies of Mercia, but Northumbria, particularly the northern part of Northumbria, like Mercia, is one of the areas where you don't get such full finds of the golden garnet jewellery that's typical of the further more southerly eastern areas of the country. But there are some possible links, but again, this raises the difficulty of identifying where items come from. On the left here, there's the scribe Webster from the Codex Amiatinus that were produced at the monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarrow, where Bede, who provides a lot of the historical background that we use, worked. And I don't know if you can see this at home, especially if you've got small screens, but on his head, Ezra is wearing a very strange device which is tied under his neck, a top knot that looks very like this item from the Staffordshire Hoard. And Leslie Webster, who's looked at this parallels in detail, suggests that these are the same things and that they are a tefillah, an item worn by Jewish priests in which may contain prayers. And we know that Bede was familiar with descriptions of this item as an item of Jewish headdress, and so an object belonging to Old Testament priests. So this is definitely a Northumbrian production, and this is showing an item that's found in the Staffordshire Hoard, but the decoration and techniques found on the tefillah are in fact closer to objects that are found in East Anglia. And in particular, has a distinctive mushroom-shaped cell containing garnets of a type which is not usually found outside East Anglia. So there's some interesting questions here, because obviously there are links between the kingdoms. But the fact that many of these items, and including, as we will have realized, many of the Christian items are actually from East Anglia, and the helmet is most probably from East Anglia, it's extremely interesting, because East Anglia is badly represented in the written sources because its own written sources have been lost. There aren't any chronicles or histories written in East Anglia, but though we do know various things about it, thanks partly to Bede. But it's generally overlooked in discussions about the Christian culture of the period. And yet we know it was an area with links with both Ireland and Francia, and had a number of early Christian workers who were either Irish who'd worked in Francia, or some Anglo-Saxons who'd been to Francia. And interestingly, Chelfrith, who commissioned the Codex Amiatinus, who was abbot of Wearmouth and Jarrow, is recorded as visiting St. Botolph in East Anglia. So there is sort of an interesting possible connection between them. It's a complex question where places come from, but I do highlight particularly the East Anglian links, because this could be one of the big changes which the study of the Staffordshire Hoard will usher in. On the left here, you have the Book of Durrow, an early copy of the Gospels, whose place of manufacture is not entirely clear. It's usually assumed to be either Northumbria or Iona, as it has a combination of Irish and Anglo-Saxon decoration that are found in early medieval manuscripts typical of these areas. But in fact, very close parallels with this animal ornament come here from the Staffordshire Hoard helmet cheek piece, particularly this item here, raising perhaps the question, as George Henderson's already explored, that perhaps the Book of Durrow could also come from East Anglia, which would be the first manuscript definitely to be identified from the province. So there are some very interesting questions about where the objects in the hoard come from, and they do have a potential to make us look again at some of what has been assumed about where the most advanced parts of the country were, particularly for adopting the early Christian culture. So now perhaps it's time to get back to Mercia and see where it fits into this. As we've seen, the proposition seems to be that these items have been acquired by Mercians rather than being produced in Mercia. Their parallels are not in Mercia. And this period in the middle of the 7th century is a period when Mercia was particularly active militarily. And particularly this king here, Pendant, who founded the fortunes of his dynasty and has the all-comers record for killing the number of other Anglo-Saxon kings in battle, particularly kings of Northumbria and kings of the East Angles. A lot of the early popular literature related to Staffordshire Hoard was particularly keen to bring out the role of Pendant, who was not himself a Christian, although he undoubtedly had Christians in his army. And he was an early candidate for having acquired the objects and perhaps deposited them, although the dating I was talking about perhaps suggests that the actual deposit of the hoard was made in the reign of one of his sons, either Wulfhere or Ethelred, both of whom were also very successful military kings, though perhaps not quite so dramatically so as Pendant, as far as we know. But of course, the objects could have been acquired by Pendant. The acquisition and the deposition are not necessarily the same thing. But let's look a bit more closely about the relationship of Mercia to other parts of the country. This map from John Blair is in fact a century after the time we're thinking about, but it's a rather useful one, so I put it in. And these blue hatched areas that he's brought out are areas of the strongest Anglian influence. And these are the areas that you saw before where the greatest number of parallels for objects in the Staffordshire Hoard were found. Here's Lichfield, by the way. This is the Staffordshire Hoard. And here's Mercia's very prominent middle position in the country. The Welsh kingdoms there, obviously in Wales. Northumbria doesn't appear here, but this area of the Middle Angles between East Angles and Mercia is why there was so much fighting between Mercia and the East Angles and Pendant. Both of them wanted to acquire bits of the territory of the Middle Angles, and it's likely that some Middle Anglian leaders, there were a number of different groups that made up the Middle Angles. Some of them would be fighting with the East Angles, some of them would be fighting with Mercia. And Lindsay, I also mentioned as a kingdom that was disputed in this case between Mercia and Northumbria. And Lindsay is where a number of the battles that are recorded took place. But this is just to give you some idea of how much has been recorded about the Mercian attacks on East Anglia and its kings at this time. And at least 4 kings killed either fighting against or in one case with Pendant. This is because once Pendant had subdued the East Angles, the king of the East Angles was obliged to provide a contingent to fight in his army. So you can see there's a lot of history of battles between East Anglia and Mercia, and so if there is some connection between the objects and East Anglia, it seems to be the case, and warfare is behind how Mercia acquired the objects. We can see that there were ample opportunities. So I'm just waiting for, I guess it's changed now. Here are the, this is the Kingdom of Lindsay again, and this is where a number of major battles took place between Mercia and Northumbria. So the other kingdom with which Mercia had many battles was Northumbria, and a number of Northumbrian kings were killed in this battle. But eventually, Pendant himself was killed in a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Winwood, which is thought to be here, when the Northumbrian is slain by the Northumbrian king Oswy after, well, we'll come to some of the circumstances immediately before the battle in a moment. So this is another area of interest, and it's one of the areas where there have been finds of similar pommels to those found in the hoard. So one possibility is that the objects were taken from the battlefield, looted from the battlefield. And Francis Lenehan, Old English scholar, has done a very interesting re-examination of some of the poetry about battles written in the Old English period in the light of the Staffordshire Hoard. And in particular, I've picked out here a quotation from Judith, the Old English poems of Judith. And here the Assyrians have been defeated in battle, and the Bethulians return to loot the corpses. And this is not in the Bible version. It's been added into the Old English poem that was written from the Bible, presumably because this was such a feature of Old English battle. And here we take from the hated ones, their unliving ancient foes, blood-stained battle plunder, shining ornaments, shield and broadsword, bright helmets, beloved treasures. Well, almost what we've got in the Staffordshire Hoard, except rather surprisingly, we haven't got any fittings from shields, which we might expect. And there are other fittings, such as from belts, that one might expect to be taken as plunder. But certainly there's a similar idea here. Perhaps the point to be made here is that in the poem, the Bethulians are not being blamed for taking the loot. Instead, it's a quite natural thing for them to do. It's an expected thing for them to do. And I think this is probably quite an interesting attitude to bear in mind when thinking about the hoard. So that's one possibility, that these items were collected up on the battlefield and taken back to Mercia. But there are other possibilities as well. And behind the fighting, particularly between Mercia and Northumbria, were issues about who was to be top dog, who was to be overlord of the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And this is something to which both Mercia and Northumbria aspired. Before Edwin of Northumbria had been a great overlord, then Pendant had really taken his place, disputed with Oswy, and eventually Oswy took over from Penda, and then Penda's sons took over from the Northumbrians again. So it's something that sort of goes backwards and forwards. And overlordship was evidently marked by what's usually referred to as a shorthand as payment of tribute. But it's never been quite clear exactly what was paid as tribute. And there's one very notable payment of tribute, and this is when Pendant of Mercia took a huge army consisting of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that were subject to him and British kingdoms from Wales, which were allied with him. And he went up to the Firth of Forth, which was part of Northumbria at this time, and forced Oswy of Northumbria to pay him a huge tribute. And this is recorded by Bede, but also in a Welsh source. So we've got two different versions, which is quite interesting. Bede records how Oswy forced Pendant to hand over an incalculable and incredible store of royal treasures and gifts, ornamenta regia, as the price of peace. And the Historia Brittonum also picks out how Pendant acquired great riches from Oswy, and which he then distributed to the kings of the British, who aren't mentioned by Bede, but they're there in the British source. And it was on his way back from collecting this tribute that Oswy overtook Pendant. So here they are out on the Firth and Forth. We saw the Battle of Winwood down right in Lincolnshire, or certainly in that sort of area, the headwaters of the Trent. Oswy had chased Pendant and his allies all the way down there from the Firth of Forth, and then defeated him in battle and presumably took back the treasures. But there is an interesting question here. Is that what the Staffordshire Hoard is? Is it part of the royal treasures that Oswy had handed over to Pendant? I mean, not this particular handover, perhaps, although you could envisage circumstances in which somebody might have got back to Mercia with part of the treasure, but presumably Oswy took it back when he defeated Pendant. But is this the type of thing that was handed over as royal treasures? Is this some sort of specialized payment? Well, to understand the hoard more, we have to understand the place where it was found. And De la Hook has done some very good work on his, and this is the hoard find. Here it is, situated beside a Roman road. And as you might have noticed from the other maps I showed, Roman roads are still very important in the Anglo-Saxon period, and it was how Penda and his forces and all his enemies traveled around the country. And the find spot of the Staffordshire Hoard, when I showed you at the beginning, I said it was rather apparently uninteresting. And this was the general view when the hoard was found. But in fact, one of the great advances that's been made in studying how Anglo-Saxon government worked and kingship worked in the last 15 years or so is to realize that open air sites that are on no man's land between other areas were in fact highly important in the early period, and it's when significant meetings took place. And this is exactly what the Staffordshire Hoard site on the Cannock Chase is like. It's on the one hand, it's between, as we've seen, the edge of Anglo-Saxon settlement, or rather what we would consider Anglo-Saxon influence, Anglo-Saxon culture, Lichfield, Tamworth, the centre of the Mercians. And over here, we have areas where there are very, very few Anglo-Saxon sites, and where there were very few Anglo-Saxons to be found, predominantly areas of British culture surviving. And at a slightly later point in the 9th century, the people on the east side are known as the Tom-Seater, and these may be the original Mercian settlers. Those on the west side were known as the Pensa-Seater, after the River Penk, and these were predominantly British people. And this was a no man's land between them, where meetings might take place. And a close-up of work that's been done on the site, very interesting place names nearby. Hammerwich, a place where there is ironworking. Is this where objects are disassembled as in the Staffordshire Hoard, precious objects going in one direction, other precious objects going somewhere else, and perhaps the discarded sword blades, etc., going off to a third area for reworking. Other potential things that you often find on these meeting sites, various names like Low that indicate a burial mound, etc. And it's not just, there are various types of meeting that took place here. And John Baker and Stuart Brooks, who have studied these assembly sites, have in particular point out the importance of muster sites where armies were mustered. And it must be admitted, this would be an excellent muster site for Penda's allies or Mercian allies to assemble, people to come from the east to meet Penda here, people to come from Wales to join Penda here. And another significant place name we have in the general vicinity, Shire Oak, when Alfred musters his forces before the Battle of Edington. People are come to meet him from all directions at Iley Oak. These oak trees are a significant part of these sites, places where people could assemble. And possibly it's not just assembling that took place here. There could also be demustering. These could also be places where the army would meet for the last time, where perhaps the spoils of war would be shared out. So both of these things, I think, could provide context in which the disassembled hoard might be deposited. And one must, I think about whether it has been deliberately deposited, not just as a popular interpretation start with, oh, this was someone who'd stolen the material and they just hid it there. I don't think it's this sort of site at all. I think we must consider that this is a very deliberate deposition. The objects are not perhaps just broken up for ease of assembly, for removal from where they might have been collected and to be carried back to Mercia. That could be part of it. but that also there may be other significance to them. I was thinking, perhaps thinking about it alongside other hoard sites. What type of a hoard is it? On the one hand, it's got some aspects perhaps of these war booty offerings from slightly earlier period in Denmark. And these are thought to be a rejoicing or a thanksgiving, or after enemy has been defeated, and all their weapons, and in some cases individuals, but in this case just their weapons and everything else that they owned has been thrown into the bog. So there's some similarities with the Staffordshire Hoard, but there's not the sort of careful picking out of the wealthy items. But these sort of deposits in bogs are usually thought of as being permanent deposits with no intention of recovery. On the other hand, you could see some parallels with these slightly earlier, but sort of late Roman, early medieval hoards from found in particularly in Scotland, where the hack silver, where instead of using coins as currency, the weight of silver was being used, rather like as with the Vikings later. And these have often been seen as recoverable hoards, like coin hoards, but so many of these are sort of coming up now, and in some unusual circumstances, that perhaps one has to be a bit more flexible and think, well, could hoards like this also be a Thanksgiving deposit of some kind? Not necessarily a recoverable deposit. And Svante Fischer, who provided an overview of the Scandinavian hoards for the Staffordshire Hoard book, he points out here that although people have tried to find some way of dividing up the hoards, of seeing some pattern in their behavior, the more he looks at them and the more that come up, he thinks the fine categories are indicative of a number of practices and ideas that are sometimes hard for us to understand. And I think this is probably quite a good statement for the Staffordshire Hoard, that it certainly falls into this sort of category of rather unusual, rather hard to understand. And finally, when thinking about it, one must realize these objects, most of them have got a very vibrant iconography. Some of them we've seen have got Christian iconography, but others are birds and beasts and fish that may well have other significance, that may well be connected with other gods. So there could be another aspect of the hoard. So are these in fact objects that are dangerous, that have been activated as in various religious ways, in supernatural ways, so that they're going to protect and enhance the people owning them? Is this why this material has been sheared off and buried? Is it perhaps too hot to handle, too dangerous? So I'm going back now to the hoard as it is at the end, and I've explored, I hope, some of the aspects of it and the difficult things. So exactly what is it? What is it doing there? And some of the things we have to think about when trying to reach a conclusion, we've got to see it's highly selective. Even of precious objects that were worn to the battlefield, it's highly selective. Only some of them have got in. It also seems to be associated with enemies of Mercia, as we've seen, and it's been buried, not necessarily with intent to retrieve, but it's not necessarily the whole of any assemblage. Objects like the helmet, we've only got parts of it. Where's the rest of it, etc. Where are other precious items that might have been taken at the same time in battle? Is it just part of a particular category of items in the Mercian treasury used for very special types of activity, such as the paying of tribute, but perhaps for communication with the supernatural in various ways could be another aspect of it. And it does begin to look like, when we put together, I haven't got it all here, but you've seen that there is one helmet, one very special set of war gear that goes with it, like the seax I showed you, and one very richly caparisoned war horse. So we've got a leader, and we seem to have a picked group of men, his leading followers with him. That's what's being symbolized here. And we've seen that the objects are found at a significant site, a place of assembly, perhaps a place of muster. Well, this could be, or demuster. So is this a giving of thanks after a successful return to Mercia? Or could it even be before setting out on a campaign to try and bring about the destruction of the enemy by deliberately destroying and hiding objects that were taken from them on a previous occasion? And I've just got one here, a quotation from Beowulf. And this is after Beowulf has killed his great enemy, Grendel's mother. And he has slain and dismembered Grendel's mother with a magnificent sword, but the sword itself had been dismembered in the process. And Beowulf could only bring back the hilt to show what he had done. And here he says, "I carried that hilt away from the enemies, avenged the terrible deeds, the murderous slaughter of the Danes, as was fitting." So here we have a lot of hilts. Is this again some sort of revenge that has been taken place, that is being celebrated? And notice here the "as was fitting." This is accepted behavior at the time. So I don't know if this is the right solution or not, but it shows you some of the ways that we can go to try and understand the hoard and how it can lead us into ways of thinking that are not our own. And this, of course, is one of the things that we have to do for the 7th century. We can only go so far. We read Bede, we read someone who's been educated in a way we're familiar with, who writes in a way that we're familiar with, which seems very civilized and a fairly logical way of thinking. But there's more to the 7th century than that. And for the historian, or indeed the archaeologist or the old English literature specialist, it's very hard to get into the minds of people of that time. But the Staffordshire Hoard, being so unusual, makes one ask questions and to go back to texts that we know and to see, yes, is there a different way of looking at them from that which we had considered before? So this is by no means the end of the story. There are going to be many other people with many other good ideas. But these, I hope, are some that you will find interesting and give you some idea of how we hope to take forward interpretation of the Staffordshire Hoard and how it might give us a new understanding of the 7th century and its history. Thank you very much.
Well, Barbara, thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely splendid. I'm sure it's going to provoke a number of questions, and if you would like to write your questions in the chat, then Matt will read them out and put them to Barbara. Perhaps while people are doing that, I could, just sort of ask a few questions, Barbara, myself.
Yeah, sure.
And I mean, I think almost the impression that you gave, and perhaps it was because of the way you described it, was that in many ways we had the clues, we had the hints of evidence, and we just hadn't got the Staffordshire Hoard in which to sort of act as a central object around to allow us to interpret these hints of evidence. I mean, is that the way you see it? I mean, how do you see in the development of Anglo-Saxon studies, early Anglo-Saxon studies, how do you place the Staffordshire Hoard? I mean, is it like another Sutton Hoo, in the sense that Sutton Hoo precipitated our new understanding of Anglo-Saxon England. Does the Staffordshire Hoard do something similar, do you think?
I don't think it's quite as life-changing as the Sutton Hoo ship burial was, because until that point, people really thought, oh, this was the Dark Ages. People were hardly capable of making a pot, let alone anything else. And this wonderful material gave people a completely different view. And of course, then when they went to look, they realized that, yes, there are other treasures, there are other signs of this type of thing. But yes, I think it has got that potential to look at things differently, and I'd be very interested in the work that Francis Lenehan did, who did just that. He went back to Beowulf and to the other poetry, like the Judith that I quoted, and he realized that there were all these things about how taking loot was wonderful, and how the sort of thing you should do was punish your enemies and make sure you plundered the battlefield and took them away. And in a way, we knew that because one of the ways in which, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, victory is reported is that, yes, the winning side had possession of the battlefield. They had what was on the battlefield. But I think the Staffordshire Hoard has made one to think about, well, yes, what does happen after a great battle? And what is the attitude to the items that are left behind? And so yeah, I think we are going to see a new way into the thinking, not completely new thinking, but a new way in, perhaps.
Yes, thank you. Matt, are there questions which have appeared in the chat to put to Barbara? Barbara, also, do you want to stop sharing your screen now as well?
I thought I had. Perhaps I haven't.
Down at the bottom, I think.
Right. Okay. Oh dear. Oh. Oh dear, that's rather sad. Okay, so I've been talking to you, Mark, which is very nice.
You've had a very appreciative audience here. I'm sure, Barbara, you will have a very appreciative audience elsewhere when people have a chance to see this. I mean, I think it was an absolutely marvellous lecture, and I think what struck me was the way in which you were able to bring these different strands of evidence together. The local evidence, the evidence from Bede and other historical sources, to sort of produce this unified view. And I appreciate that this is both the work of others as well as yours, but I mean, I think we have got a sort of much more rounded view now. This is what strikes me of the Staffordshire Hoard, which when it first appeared, it was very difficult to know exactly how to interpret it. And it looks as though we are, if not reaching a firm conclusion, because that's not the nature of academic study, but at least we've got a better understanding of it, haven't we? Yeah,
that's right. Yes, I mean, I'm drawing very heavily on many people's work, and I hope I made clear, but it's certainly something I find continually interesting. And I keep going back and finding more and more.
Well, since there aren't any questions, can I thank you, Barbara, very, very, very much for an absolutely fascinating talk. And I think it's our loss that people have not been able to see it and put questions to you, but at least they will have a chance to hear in due course your lecture. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, God.
Okay, then.
How embarrassing. I had no idea.